So I'm going to go with your bio. That's okay. And I'm going to try not to gush profusely because I'm a huge fan. So we have for our keynote speaker on the Cathars and the Inquisition and inspired movements, Stephen O'Shea, who I'm very happy to say is Canadian, even if an expat. So Toronto-born author and journalist Stephen O'Shea moved to France in the early 80s. There, he took up journalism shortly after completing postgraduate studies in politics at the University of Paris. I'm just going to say that in English because, is there a French way to say Paris? Paris? And the prestigious Institute, see, there's French in this. Politique de Paris. In 1989, Elle magazine relocated O'Shea to New York to be a senior features editor of their American edition. In 1993, he returned to Paris, where he worked as Variety's film critic and published articles on French culture and politics for American, British, French, and Canadian magazines, including The Observer, The Times of London, Harper's Bazaar, Interview, Allure, and Mother Jones. To research the perfect heresy, O'Shea moved to the... How do you pronounce this? See, we should get Will to do this. Yep, in southern France in 1997, where he spent 2 years immersing himself in Cathar lore. In 2011, he continued his exploration on the Cathars and the Inquisition in France with the Friar of Carcassonne. In addition to the Perfect Heresy, O'Shea is also the author of the widely acclaimed Back to the Front, a hiker's meditation on the trenches of World War I, and most recently the Alps, a human history from Hannibal to Haiti and beyond. And Stephen O'Shea currently lives in Providence and has two daughters, Rachel and Eve. And I just wanted to say the part I like doing, because I don't normally do any public speaking, is the Apostolic Johannite Church as a esoteric and liberal Christian and Gnostic church, I think is particularly indebted to your research and insight on a subject that is very near and dear to its heart. And also relevant for our time. So on behalf of the communities and clergy and people of the AJC, I want to say thank you for your work and your diligence and being very entertaining at the same time. So my friends, please give Stephen O'Shea a very warm welcome. And over to you, sir.
Hello to everyone, and thank you for inviting me to speak to this gathering. Thank you to Your Eminence for reaching out to me. Sean McCann, a nice Polish name. First of all, do not be terrified about the amount of time I'm going to take to give this address. Yes, it's a big sheaf of papers, but it is printed in 28-point type since I'm too damn vain to wear my reading glasses all the time. So settle in for 50 minutes, 50 minutes or so. I've pillaged several of my past books, these ones, to pull this presentation together for you. Okay. So today I'd like to talk about change. Change in medieval society and change in the last 2 centuries, especially regarding the wildly successful religion of the Cathars, which was brutally stamped out by a horrified Catholic Church in the 13th and 14th centuries, only to arise again as an intellectual and spiritual curio in the 19th and 20th centuries. So change. Change is a maddening constant in history and the history of thought. But sometimes it is not so maddening. It can be delightful. Here we are in Portland, Oregon, in 2018, a laid-back, chill, woke, macchiato mecca. Had we gathered here 95 years ago, in 1923, we would be in one of the 2 American capitals of the Ku Klux Klan. The mayor and most elected officials, all elected officials, were proud bigots and card-carrying members of the Klan. And the town newspapers, all of them, printed blood-curdling editorials about the pernicious evils spread by Catholics and Jews. There were few African Americans here at that time, but if any were foolish enough to come to Portland, they would be run out of town lickety-split. So change could be good. I'm glad it came to Portland. And I bet Portland is glad it came to Portland. But change can be bad or disconcerting. It all depends on one's perspective. In the 12th century, Europe changed. It woke up from its long slumber. In the 7th and 8th centuries, as one Belgian historian famously said, quote, "The last of the Merovingian kings fell asleep in their ox carts," unquote. Following them was the glorious blip of the Carolingian revival under Charlemagne in the 9th century. Then a silent, sepulchral curtain once again fell over Christendom. Then came the year 1000 and the 200 years to follow. We need not dwell here on the causes of the 12th century's spectacular awakening. Rather, we will look at its effects. It is said that the stonemasons of what would become France cut more stone during this time than did the Pharaoh's men of ancient Egypt, all in the service of erecting magnificent cathedrals to the glory of God, the glory of the church, and to the glory of their town. The style of these cathedrals spread throughout Europe as builders abandoned heavy but beautiful Romanesque construction for what was then called the French style, and which we call Gothic. Having picked up that insult, Gothic means barbarian, from the detractors of the Middle Ages who sneered downwards at their forebears from the heights of the great Italian Renaissance. In the time that concerns us, the 12th century, gigantic castles were erected, especially in the Crusader states of Palestine, and towns and cities burgeoned. Stadtluft macht frei. City air makes you free. So ran the medieval German adage, and city air did just that. Along with the quickening of commerce and the opening of trade routes, dormant since the times of the old Romans, opinions and ideas spread across Europe at lightning speed, confounding the grandees of the feudal order, the clergy and nobility, and spurring a nascent class of literate laymen, burghers, businessmen, artisans, clerks, lawyers, to challenge the ruling orthodoxies that had held sway for centuries. It was a heady time. Most important, learning was wrested away from the hands of the church. In the growing centers of Europe, those who were called schoolmen gathered to spread the word of Aristotelian logic, rediscovered through translations of the ancient Greeks from the libraries of Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, that being Toledo, Cordoba, Granada, and Seville. In Oxford, Cambridge, Bologna, and especially Paris, a freewheeling marketplace of ideas, of reason, was conducted by the schoolmen and their students. A century before these centers yielded to the church and were founded as universities to enforce orthodoxy. But in the 12th century, as opposed to the 13th, no holes were barred. Perhaps the most famous feud between past and future at that time concerned two prodigious men of the 12th. In one corner was Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential churchman of the time, founder of the highly successful promoter of the highly successful Cistercian order of monks and preacher of the Second Crusade, who, on that occasion, popularized the jaw-dropping distinction about killing a Muslim. When you killed a Muslim, one was not committing homicide, that is, killing a human being, but malicide, killing evil. So pick up your swords and slash away, said Bernard. God is okay with that. In the other corner stood Pierre Abelard, the Paris schoolman par excellence. He wielded Aristotelian dialectics like a scalpel, to the delight of his hordes of students in the Latin Quarter. The followers of Bernard of Clairvaux and Pierre Abelard fought it out in the centuries to come, much like the followers of Adam Smith and Karl Marx went head-to-head during the Industrial Revolution and its aftermath. But I digress. That's enough of a throat-clearing introduction to the period. Let's get down to business. It is time to talk theology. Yes, theology. A friend of mine who was at the Harvard Divinity School supplied me with the following way to distinguish between philosophy and theology. If you are a philosopher, you are in a totally dark, windowless room, and you are stumbling around trying to catch a black cat. Of course, you can't see it, so you'll never catch it. Now, if on the other hand, you are a theologian, you're in that same totally dark, windowless room, and you too are stumbling around and trying to catch that black cat. The only problem is that your black cat doesn't exist. Okay, so that's not my joke. Don't blame me, blame Harvard. Now, change again. The changing tenor and time of the 12th century strained the spiritual chord innate in the music of what it is to be human. Change enhanced and encouraged spiritual longing. The towns, the cities, the new classes of people, the poor and destitute rubbing shoulders with the respectable and the wealthy. Where is God in all of this? Who can guide us through this unholy scrum? The church had changed little since the Dark Ages. Its best men and women were monks and nuns, locked away in remote monasteries, far from the doings of this new, frightening world. Yes, cathedrals were springing up, but how was the church addressing day-to-day life? In some places, the pastoral mission took hold. In others, the usual feudal swank, as well as corruption and tax gouging, seemed destined to go on forever. In the Languedoc, in what is now southwestern France, and what was then the prime hotbed of the Cathar heresy, the Catholic clergy, apparently, was woefully inadequate to the spiritual needs of its flock. One critic said, and I'll quote from The Perfect Heresy, this is a quotation, a critic said, "Blind men, dumb dogs who can no longer bark, men who will do anything for money, zealous in avarice, lovers of gifts, seekers of rewards. The chief cause of all these evils is the Archbishop of Narbonne, whose God is money, whose heart is in his treasury, who is concerned only with gold." And that critic, by the way, was none other than the Pope, Pope Innocent III. So, in the 12th century, the zeitgeist called for something new. The answer was first given by a series of lone charismatic preachers, self-proclaimed messiahs, who would take over a town, sometimes an entire diocese, with their zealous preaching and theatrical mortifications. Among these men, and they were almost always men, a common thread can be distinguished. They all preached apostolic poverty, an idea whose time had come. Apostolic poverty. In contradistinction to the gaudy finery of the church and the conspicuous wealth of the townsmen, wealth that eventually led to the enactment of sumptuary laws, whereby the lovely burgesses of the town were enjoined to put away their jewels, furs, lace, and other refinements that enhanced their womanly attributes. But I digress again. Anyway, against all this wealth, these lone charismatic wolves called for a life in imitation of Christ and his apostles. Apostolic poverty. That was the key to salvation. But such lone men were Roman candles, flaring up in the sky for a decade or so, then gone, murdered or disgraced, forgotten within a generation. The church, although alarmed, swatted them away like flies. What was feared by the churchmen was the possibility of a rival church or a rival movement being established, one that would lure men and women off the path that led toward Rome. A movement, a church. This, of course, was highly unlikely, laughable even. The Saracens, as the Muslims were then called, were far off, harmless, at a distance. So such a thing as an alternative church or an alternative movement was obviously not part of God's plan. But that is precisely what occurred. Catharism, a rival Christian faith to Catholicism, came to roost in the Languedoc and in Lombardy, in northern Italy, and it came in on tiptoe. In the 1140s, the powerful Bernard of Clairvaux, remember Bernard, Mr. Malicide, came south to preach a revival tour against the followers of a heretical leader known as Henry of Lausanne. There were rumors that some of the faithful were slipping, because of Henry and other heretics, in their observance of orthodoxy, and the great man was needed to set things straight. In 1145, at Verfeil, a small town north of Toulouse, Bernard of Clairvaux thundered out his oratorical introduction, an overture leading up to his overawing of the crowd. After a few moments, After a moment, a few titters could be heard. This grew into laughter, gales of laughter. Then someone opened the great doors at the back of the church, and knights came in, slapping their swords on their shields, creating a clanging echo chamber under the stone vaulting. Bernard was drowned out. The greatest churchman of the 12th century had been laughed out of town. So how could this have happened? How, indeed? There was no charismatic lone wolf in sight, parading around in a loincloth and wowing the crowd into action. No, the people simply did not believe what Bernard had to say. They believed in something else. The church had been blindsided. Over the previous generation or so, we don't know exactly when, itinerant preachers traveling in pairs had spread out in the Languedoc and Italy, carrying a message. The church was illegitimate. The sacraments were a hoax. Roma, R-O-M-A, was the opposite of amor, A-M-O-R, that is, love. These pairs of men and women traveled modestly, exhibiting the apostolic poverty so keenly appreciated. They had a trade, often in history, they were said to be weavers, and they established themselves in the heart of the towns, the very heart of the towns. The place is whipsawed by change. They supported themselves, they led exemplary lives of holiness, they built no churches, they preached in houses and in fields. They carried a message of mixed hope. There was no eternal agony of hell awaiting us after death. Hell was here, now, in the land of suffering, in the land of the material world. This is important, the material world, the world of matter. These people, later called Cathars, were believers in dualism, a strain of faith with a long posterity in Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. It is monotheism with a twist, with a theodicy, that is, an explanation of why, if there's a supposedly an all-good God out there, why can evil possibly exist in the world? Why then evil? Why suffering? Why pain? Is God a malicious trickster? Dualists believe that there is indeed a good God, but there is also an evil force, or principle, or counterweight, a bad God, if you will, who created matter and the world and all of its accompanying ills. The good God pays no attention to the handiwork of the evil God. That's why the sacraments, an appeal to the good God through the mediation of clergymen, were utterly ridiculous, meaningless. The good God had no time for such pantomimes of matter. Therefore, no baptism, no marriage, no material churches, no tithing, no reverence for the cross, which was a material example of torture and nothing more. One Cathar preacher, according to Inquisition transcripts, mockingly described making the sign of the cross thusly: "This is my brow, this is my beard, this is my shoulder, this is my other shoulder." That's actually verbatim from an Inquisition interrogation. As for the swearing of oaths of fealty, the very glue that held medieval society together, binding liege lord to vassal and vassal to his liege, that too was bogus. The good God was not looking down on two creatures of matter performing a meaningless act. So not only was the church undermined, so too was the entire underpinning of the life and society of the laity. In Catharism, as it developed, what was needed was the adoption of a good life with malice toward none, whether Catholic or Muslim or Jew. An instance of that last occurred in Toulouse, where Cathar preachers managed to abolish a Holy Week tradition called Strike the Jew. In that week, it was open season on Jews, who could be assaulted for no good reason and without any legal repercussions. The Cathars said no, so it was stopped. Their preachers were called good men and good women, or just good Christians. The church would later label them the perfect, as in the perfect heresy, not because they were perfection incarnate, but because they were perfected heretics, as in fully fledged heretics, as opposed to those still developing. The perfect fasted frequently, ate no meat, refrained from sex and most of the material joys of life in the expectation that at death They would shake off the bonds of matter and join the good God forever. Those who could not follow their example, the believers, or credentes, as the church labeled them, they were not ready to live a perfected life of self-denial. They would, it seems, return to this world after death for another incarnation. And what was remarkable, there was no pecking order in the heresy's reincarnation doctrine. You could be a nobleman in this life, a milkmaid in the next. Only when you became one of the perfect could you break the cycle and live out your last life on earth. So the implications of just this one belief are enormous. The medieval sexual status quo vanished. We are all just hapless creatures of matter, whether man or woman in this life, because we might be woman or man in the next. Indeed, much of Catharism's strength lay in its appeal to women. Many a noblewoman or burgess, their child-rearing days behind them, would retire from active life and make their homes a sort of Cathar convent, welcoming girls and accepting the rigorous life of the perfect. This entailed receiving the one great Cathar sacrament, the soul one, the consolamentum. The consolamentum required the already established perfect to lay their hands upon the head of the supplicant and repeatedly recite the Lord's Prayer. Cathars believed that the consolamentum had originated with Christ's apostles and had continued as a sort of metaphysical game of tag all the way down to their era. So women flocked to their faith. In a famous exchange, a southern nobleman, when reprimanded by a churchman for not persecuting the heretics, gave this plaintive defense: "We cannot harm them. They are our mothers, our sisters. We have been reared by them." So, where in the world did this belief come from, and why was it successful in some areas and not in others? Two questions, which deserve two answers. It is thought that Catharism came from Eastern Europe, perhaps the Byzantine Empire. It is also thought that Catharism may have originated in the cathedral schools of Western Europe, which taught not only the church fathers, but Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism with its emphasis, with its particular take on the material. Could have been a combination of the two. We don't know. There's no paper trail. So as for the hypothesis from the East, the newly opened trade routes trafficked not only in goods, but also in ideas. At the turn of the millennium, a very successful dualist heresy, its adherents known as Bogomils, held sway in the Balkans. The last of the Bogomils, by the way, is said to have died in 1867. Western dualism, Catharism, may have come from the Balkans, but we really don't know. There's no paper trail. Could have, again, come from the cathedral schools and Neoplatonism. We do know, or we sort of know, it's still disputed, that at St. Félix de Caraman, a village near Carcassonne, a synod of dualist clergy, an astounding heretical conclave of sorts, was held in May, I should have been more careful there. Okay,
No, you shouldn't.
Was held in May of 1167, with guests from as far afield as Milan and Constantinople. So the Bogomils may have played a large role in Western dualism. If we are to believe popular etymology, the slur used to describe Cathars, that is, bougre, which gave English the word bugger, is in fact a corruption of the word Bulgar, or Bulgarian. So the Balkans left their footprint. But why dualism? What's the attraction? There is no easy answer to this. There have been dualist faiths throughout history, the one to live on in memory being that of the Persian prophet Mani in the 3rd century, whose followers were known as Manichees. As for Christian dualists, aside from the Bogomils, other sects were recorded in the Byzantine era, most notably the Paulicians at the turn of the millennium. Certainly, dualism makes a certain sort of sense, in the same way that we count base 10 because of these. 10. If we had 8, we'd count in base 8. We wouldn't have civilization without thumbs, but we would count in base 8. But for dualism, in the same way, first of all, there are 2s everywhere. We have 2 hands, 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 ears, 2 eyes, and until very recently, we had an accepted framework of two genders. But to my mind, and really to my mind alone, the most important natural influence, the one that makes us susceptible to dualism, is light and dark, day and night. We moderns have more or less abolished that distinction, but it was perhaps the most important fact of daily life. You had light in the day and no light at night. It was dark, very dark at night, just the place for that black cat I spoke about. The only light came from the flame of the candle or the fire in the hearth. All else was enveloped in blackness. I think it is absolutely no coincidence at all that dualists, including the Cathars, spoke of the human soul as a spark, a divine flame, locked in the darkness of matter. My second question, why did it take off in some places and not in others? One factor concerned trade. There had to be a fluid exchange of people and ideas. But another and far more important factor concerned authority. Where the church worked hand in glove with royal authority, Catharism, the heresies, were nipped in the bud in England, France, Germany, the Rhineland. By France, I mean northern France. But in the Languedoc and Lombardy, that didn't happen. Languedoc system was one of fractured feudalism. Primogeniture did not figure into its old Roman legal system. Therefore, estates were divided and subdivided between sons and daughters over generations. So no big barons. The Count of Toulouse, although powerful, was not as powerful an interlocutor as the King of France. The church itself, divided in factions, had no one to team up with. In Lombardy, the growing independent city-states were taking shape, as was the endemic quarreling between partisans of the Pope and partisans of the Holy Roman Emperor, known to history as the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. Thus, there was no unified church and state authority that could suppress the heresy. The church at the time, of course, did not look at the Cathars from the viewpoint of political science or anthropology. Of course not. The churchmen were horrified. In a word, they freaked out. And they hit the books to look for precedents. These scholars knew that early Christianity was marked by a tremendous amount of disputation before an orthodoxy was finally hammered out. Was Christ a man? Or was he God? Or was he both? Was he real? Or just an illusion? A projection? And of course, popular in our day, did he have a girlfriend? It would be odd that a charismatic 30-something rabbi would go without one, or two, or many. So, as an example, a traveler to 4th century Constantinople, as an example of the querulousness of early Christianity. A traveler to 4th century Constantinople, Gregory of Nyssa, remarked on the disputation of his fellow Christians, and I quote this in another book, Sea of Faith. Here we go, Gregory. Everywhere, in humble homes, in the streets, in the marketplace, at street corners, one finds people talking about the most unexpected subject. If I ask for my bill, the reply is a comment about the virgin birth. If I ask the price of bread, I am told that the Father is greater than the Son. When I ask whether my bath is ready, I am told that the Son was created from nothing. End of quote. So adding to these violent disagreements were the oft-times contentious relations and pecking order disputes among the early church's 5 seats of patriarchy: Alexandria, Antioch, Constantinople, Jerusalem, and Rome. As the pagan historian Ammianus Marcellinus noted, quote, "No wild beasts were so hostile to humans as most Christians were in their savagery towards one another." So the churchmen of the 12th century, the 12th and the 13th century, scoured the texts of the early church for more information and, more important, for libels. Libels. In the millennium after Christ, when it comes to religious disagreement, there was hardly a mealy mouth in sight. Wild defamation flew, lurid rumor grew. The Cathars indulged in incestuous orgies, the fruit of their coupling destined to be roasted at birth, then consumed at satanic meals. They worshipped cats. Indeed, some think the word Cathar, far from deriving from the Greek for pure, as in catharsis, stems from the Low German for Cathar, as in a cat fanatic. They perform the so-called obscene kiss, that is, kissing the rear end of a cat. Such stories were 1,000 years old, told by the pagans of the Christians, directed at early dissenters, and they were revived by the churchmen of the 12th century when speaking of the Cathars. However, the people of Languedoc, my area of specialty, were having none of it. They knew the good men and good women. They lived among them. They saw how holy they were. They saw through the lies. Although stymied, the church was still not desperate enough to resort to force. That was unheard of at the time. Not for long, though. It tried another gambit, talking. In one of the most remarkable chapters of medieval history, public debates were sponsored by the local nobility that opposed Cathar and Catholic, the perfect and the clergy, and organized by the local nobility. This remarkable moment occurred in the first decade of the 13th century throughout Languedoc. Entire towns attended the disputations and voted on who had won the day. The Cathars had the upper hand early on, as they appeared in the simple dress of apostolic poverty, while the Catholic priests, important legates appointed by the Pope, rode in on their high horses, quite literally, and were draped in the shiniest of ecclesiastical bling. As we would say today, the optics didn't look too good. This changed with the arrival of a Spaniard, Domingo de Guzman, the future Saint Dominic. He encouraged his fellow papal legates to abandon their finery and proceed from town to town on foot, humbly, as penitents. He had obviously seen the perfect in action at their persuasive best. It has been conjectured even that the order of friars he first founded in Languedoc, the Dominicans, consciously took pages from the Cathar playbook, live poor and live in the cities. At the same time, in Italy, the followers of Francis of Assisi did the same, founding the Franciscan order of friars. Both brotherhoods, as you know, are known as the mendicant orders. That is, they lived off the donation of alms from their fellow townsmen. The prodigiously intelligent Dominic might have been able to turn some away from dualist heresy, but he did not get the chance. In 1208, a prominent papal delegate was assassinated. The finger-pointing began. In Rome, the throne of St. Peter was now occupied by the most dynamic of medieval popes, Innocent III. Pope Innocent judged that the talking cure had not worked, so he turned to the sword. He asked the King of France to have his nobles launch a crusade against the Cathars. It was not called a crusade, of course, it was the affair of the faith. But it was a crusade against Christians in the heart of Christian Europe. Those who took part were granted a remission of their sins. And, more important, many were guaranteed grants of lands and titles that would be snatched away from the Languedoc nobility. So that's why a lot of second and third sons took part in the Albigensian Crusades, because they were landless in the north. Languedoc, an ancient, independent patchwork of pride with its own language, law, and customs, would become a part of France, which was then just a middling kingdom occupying the Ile-de-France forest surrounding Paris. Pope Innocent III guaranteed that he would use his authority to make the French land grab legitimate. So began the Albigensian Crusade, so named for a center of Catharism, the town of Albigensian. The story of the crusade is told in this book, The Perfect Heresy. Read it. Suffice to say that it was a 2-decade-long pageant of atrocity and cruelty that shocked even medieval observers. I'll spare you the blow-by-blow here, but burning alive 400 people at one go and comprehensively slaughtering a city of 10 to 20,000 souls, and then rejoicing in the deed, were among the many calamities to punctuate this 20-year nightmare. When the dust and blood settled in 1229, Languedoc would become a French province, a change which we'll see was quite important 700 years later. And medieval Catharism lay in tatters. But lying in tatters does not mean destroyed. To the Church's consternation, Catharism survived, the heresy survived, discreetly, in the countryside, in the mountains, and in the hearts of the common folk. it was time for the churchmen to hit the books again. They had tried the word, talking, the sword, the crusade. Now it was time for the law. Their reading of old texts paid off. Reviving and revamping an office used for repression in the ancient Roman Empire, the churchmen established, first in Toulouse, the post of inquisitor. This very first inquisition would spawn others in subsequent centuries, papal, royal, and episcopal, aimed at a variety of enemies, the enemy du jour. But the raison d'etre for its founding was heresy, hunting down the last of the Cathars. That's why we have the Inquisition. So the task of hunting them down took over 100 years of dogged police procedure. The Dominicans did most of the dirty work. They reveled in their Latin nickname, Dominicanes, the Hounds of God. I recount much of their extermination work in the book The Friar of Carcassonne, wherein the extermination work forms the backdrop to a remarkable revolt in the year 1300 against a corrupt Inquisition, a revolt led by an insanely brave Franciscan friar, Brother Bernard de Lisieux, an all but forgotten champion for the freedom of conscience. He dared to enlist the most merciless French monarch of the Middle Ages, Philip the Fair, so named because he was good-looking, not because he was good. Philip the Fair, who shut down the Inquisition in Languedoc for a precious few years. It doesn't end badly. It ends badly, as most things do in the Middle Ages. Anyway, popular imagination has often exaggerated the evil of the Inquisition. Indeed, the Cathars took its existence as proof that the Church served an evil God. But we must not downplay or bend backwards to downplay its perniciousness. It twisted Catholicism, making it a machine of repression. The Dominicans manufactured a remarkably hideous theology, a theology of fear. Let me read from the book to explain. Now, it should be said one of the go-to texts of the Dominicans in the 13th century was a treatise called In Praise of Fear. Anyway, so, at the hands of Inquisition apologists, God received unusual treatment. God received the same treatment. In one of the more unusual roles assigned to Jesus Christ by his flock, the protean preacher of peace in the New Testament came garbed in the robes of an avenger. He had arrived on earth to persecute. Much use was made of the many violent, vengeful passages in the Old Testament, with their far fewer counterparts in the Christian scriptures, also deployed for full homiletic effect. And God was not only cruel, he was sadistic. The greatest torment of hell was not the boundless and eternal physical agony, but the sound of God's spiteful mockery and malicious cackling at the sight of such suffering. A radical Dominican thinker of the mid-13th century, Moneta of Cremona, went so far as to say that a true way to imitate God was to kill. His logic, based on the behavior of God in the Old Testament, ran something like this. God does not sin. God kills. Therefore, killing is not a sin. In some ways, this bald reversal of the sixth of the Ten Commandments was nothing new. For churchmen throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, the heyday of the Crusades, had meandered far into sophistry in their attempt to reconcile their Savior's message of nonviolence and the notion of holy war. We'll remember Bernard of Clairvaux and homicide and malicide. What was new in Moneta's formulation was that God, far from forgiving the regrettably necessary recourse to violence, instead stood cheering on the sidelines, seeing his own image in the torturers and killers. Just as the medieval hell fantasy speaks volumes about human psychology, so too does the worldview espoused by Moneta of Cremona and his followers, proving that at all times and in all places, sincere people will always find a way to justify whatever action they believe consonant with their duty, no matter how nakedly reprehensible that action is. We need only think of John Woo and and enhanced interrogation. Maneda's inquisitor differs from Dostoevsky's, whose Grand Inquisitor has no need of, indeed despises Jesus Christ. But the Dominicans may be more pernicious in that Jesus is fully in favor of persecution. The poor wretch mouldering in the dank cell of an Inquisition prison thus had no higher authority to implore for relief. He was utterly alone, damned by a God who was laughing at him. So, if you think this is Christianity, then I have a bridge in Brooklyn I want to sell to you. Unless we think that all of this remained in the realm of ideas, the realm of the black cat, the realm of theology, let me read one more passage from the Friar of Carcassonne on the methods of the Inquisition, in case we've forgotten. So Bernard Delicieux, when they shut down the Inquisition, he compiled a book on its methods and sent it out through the kingdom. The torture section, given Bernard's persuasive proclivities, must have been riveting. Although the document itself has not survived, the many indignant references to it contained in the formal charges against him at his trial suggest that, at the very least, it was distressingly colorful. Doubtless the friar evoked the torture in common use in his day, the strappado, the, quote, queen of torments, unquote, which was used to elicit confession, the, quote, queen of proofs, unquote. In this operation, the victim's hands were tied behind his back, and then the loose end of the rope coil having been played across a ceiling beam, he was raised into the air, his outstretched, distended arms bearing his full weight. Heavy weights, like bells, could be tied to his feet to make the contortion even more unbearable. Depending on the whim of the torturer, the rope could be loose for a split second, causing the victim to drop, then be reimmobilized in midair, the resultant jolt dislocating his arms or pulling them out of their sockets. The strappado might initially last only a few minutes, the time it took for the Holy Inquisitors to intone a prayer. It was suggested in Inquisitors' manuals, before being renewed if the results proved unsatisfactory. The Inquisitor had many other refinements, which Bernard would have taken care to relate in detail. For women and children, binding of the wrists tightly by coarse wet cord, then unbinding them and starting up the process once again with even more force, was considered humane. Other extremities could be useful as well. Savagely beating the soles of the feet was fairly common. This sent pain rioting up through the body. For obdurate people, an inflammable liquid could be splashed on the feet and then set alight. This attention to the body's extremities arose from the duty of the thoughtful jurist, then as now, to avoid causing major organ failure. Another common technique entails sleep deprivation. 40 hours of enforced sleeplessness came to be considered the happy and holy mean. Further treatments common in Carcassonne included the rack, other means of stretching and dislocating, the waterboard, and the shock of freezing cold water. So given this horrific treatment, the Cathars, these heretics, had disappeared by the beginning of the 14th century. Around the last perfect was burned in 1321. Okay, so next.
I was taking notes, by the way.
Uh-oh. Okay, so now let's flash forward several hundred years. The Cathars became more or less forgotten. It was said by some defenders of the Protestant Reformations that the Cathars had been proto-Protestants. I say no. Unlike many Protestant denominations, the Cathars had no time at all for the Old Testament, for the God described therein is the Creator God, that is, the evil God of matter. And if anybody worshiping this God was worshiping the wrong God. Then, in the 19th century, as in the 12th century, great change occurred. Change. The change is known to history as the Industrial Revolution. The countryside emptied. The cities grew and grew and grew. Certainties became dislodged. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? This time the canaries in the coal mine were not lone charismatic messiahs, but artists of genius. Early on, William Blake asked regretfully of his century, quote, "And was Jerusalem builded here among these dark satanic mills?" Later on, Matthew Arnold would write in Dover Beach, the poem, about the way the world was headed. The world, which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. Examples of this foreboding are legion in the 19th century. So along with this cultural misgiving, so like the misgivings of the 12th century, there came something entirely new. That is the birth of history, with a capital H. Michelet in France, Gibbon and Macaulay in Britain, Francis Parkman here. The great historians opened the archives, invented the discipline, and produced, and this is a paradox, scientific works of narrative literature. That is, history with a capital H. For the Cathars, this meant scholars rediscovering them in the archives of the city of Toulouse, in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, in the Vatican. The Cathars came back into the light of day just as the world was changing drastically in the way we looked at the past. Where the Cathars had lived and died, the Languedoc, this change came accompanied by a cultural renaissance, a movement to reclaim the language, traditions, history, and literature of southern France. This 19th century movement was a reaction to the centralizing bulldozer of the French Third Republic, dominated by Paris. A movement in Provence and Languedoc called the Félibrige, and led by one aptly named Frédéric Mistral, was the spearhead of this attempt to revive the time of the troubadours and the Cathars. The Cathar Alamo, a mountain peak south of Toulouse named Montségur, where in 1824 over 200 Cathar perfect were besieged and eventually captured and burned alive, became a metaphor for the new nationalism of Languedoc and of the region of Aquitaine. Its greatest polemicist was one Napoleon Perrat. Just listen to an excerpt to get a taste of his heady brew. He talks of Montségur here, the Cathar Alamo, as I said. Montségur was an Essenian Zion, a Platonist Delphi of the Pyrenees, a Johannite Rome, condemned and untamed in Aquitaine. Montségur, from its naked rock, looked out sadly but steadily at the Louvre and the Vatican. In its grotto, it sheltered three irreconcilable enemies of theocracy: the Word, the nation, and freedom, those powers of the future. It was from its peak that this sweet and terrible conjuration first took wings under the name of Spirit, to make its secret way through the winds, its invisible path through the storms. It was this mysterious horseman, mounted on the tempests and the thunder, who would, through the religious revolution of the 16th century and the political revolution of the 18th, regenerate Europe and the whole world. So, this was basically Hegelian republicanism meeting medieval heresy. Interesting cocktail. So let's move far away from Languedoc now to look at another change that brought the Cathars to the fore. In the history of colonialism, what is often overlooked is the influence of the colonized upon the colonizer. Usually we go the other way around. But Europe's worldwide reach in the 19th century brought the belief systems of the East, of India, Persia, and elsewhere, back to London, Paris, and Berlin. The spiritualism of the East, or was said then Orientalist occultism, gave some solace to Europeans unhappy with their century. In some places it took the name of theosophy, its most famous avatar being a Russian-born theosophist named Helena Blavatsky, who did much to influence English esoteric thought. In France, a certain Joséphin Péladan, a good friend of Baudelaire, founded a neo-Gnostic church founded upon some Cathar precepts. And in the Proustian drawing rooms of Paris's Faubourg Saint-Germain, the Ouija boards came out, and the post-apéritif séance became de rigueur. Two frequent apparitions at these séances were prominent Cathars of the 13th century, the great perfect preacher named Guillabert of Castres, and a doomed Cathar passionaria and noblewoman named Esclarmonde de Foix, transformed into a fainting, half-clad martyr of exceptional beauty. Esclarmonde was fashioned by the 19th century aesthetic into the feminine ideal. Her hometown, Foix, in southern France, attempted to erect a suitably erotic statue of her, but the initiative was narrowly voted down. But we must not exaggerate here. Such 19th century spiritual longing remained the domain of the privileged few. The majority of Europeans, particularly the downtrodden working classes, had no such luxury of thought. Some, of course, turned to politics, communism, socialism, anarchism, etc. Others, and many others, sought solace in absinthe and oblivion. An example: we are all accustomed to beautiful impressionist paintings of people disporting themselves in guinguettes or riverside bars and dance halls along the banks of the Seine and the Marne. But that was only a small part of the picture. The truth is not so decorous. Every Saturday night in the latter half of the 19th century, thousands of poor Parisians would walk the few miles to the guinguette bars of the Marne, drink and dance copiously, fornicate al fresco, sleep it off on the riverbank, then trudge home on Sunday, sullen and hungover, ready for another week of despair. Not much room there for the spiritual. Much of the middle and upper classes had similar entertainments, though behind closed doors. No, something would have to happen that would affect all of society, to make it lose its moorings, to open it to spiritualism and occultism, and, in some of its wake, Catharism. That event occurred between 1914 and 1918, when Matthew Arnold's premonition of ignorant armies clashing by night became a dread reality. In my book on the First World War, I describe at length the effects of that conflict. Read it. But here, I must cede precedence to an artist of genius, F. Scott Fitzgerald. Shortly after the war, Fitzgerald has Dick Diver, his protagonist in Tender is the Night, visit the Western Front, the trenches. So let's listen to Diver speak. And it sums up my point. This Western Front business couldn't be done again, not for a long time. This took religion and years of plenty and tremendous sureties and the exact relation that existed between the classes. You had to have a whole-souled sentimental equipment going back further than you could remember. You had to remember Christmas and postcards of the Crown Prince and his fiancée, and little cafes in Valence, and beer gardens in Unter den Linden, and weddings at the Mairie, and going to the Derby, and your grandfather's whiskers. This kind of battle was invented by Lewis Carroll and Jules Verne, and whoever wrote Undine, and country deacons bowling, and marraines in Marseille, and girls seduced in the back lanes of Württemberg and Westphalia. Why, this was a love battle. There was a century of middle-class love spent here. All my beautiful, lovely, safe world blew itself up here with a great gust of high explosive love. So, nice passage. So, the absolute shock of the First World War on Europe, while affecting every aspect of society, deeply affected spirituality. Catharism and the Languedoc emerged from the salons of Paris to find a broader audience beyond the boundaries of France. Belgians founded a neo-Gnostic church near Toulouse. Dutch Rosicrucians descended on Carcassonne. The cities of Carcassonne and Toulouse became a hotbed of neo-Cathar literary activity and pseudo-Cathar history. The Arthurian Glastonbury crowd of Britain became turned on to Catharism. In the 1930s, even the Nazis became involved. But I need to back up here. The Cathar story comes complete with a treasure hunt, a real treasure hunt. We know from Inquisition interrogations that shortly before the fall of Montségur in 1244, remember that's the Cathar Alamo, 2 men rappelled down a sheer cliff face carrying the treasury of the Cathars. The French language, and by the way, and this is important, uses the same word for treasury and treasure, trésor. Anyway, they hid the Cathar treasury or treasure somewhere, and it has never been found. But it has fueled wild speculation. So, back to the Nazis. An SS officer named Otto Rahn visited the region in the 1930s and decided that the Cathars were actually the original Aryans. And their treasure? A tablet inscribed with the non-Jewish Ten Commandments. Of course. His books were bestsellers in Nazi Germany. Others said, no. The treasure was the Holy Grail, celebrated in medieval epic poems and revived memorably in Richard Wagner's opera Parsifal. Cathar Grail enthusiasts claimed that Parsifal was actually Trencavel, the historical lord of Carcassonne, and Montsalvat was actually Montségur. So by mid-centuries, the Cathars had infiltrated French and European consciousness. An analogy. The Cathars were to European spiritual seekers what the Hopis are to some of their American counterparts. Depending on the post-war decade, the Cathars were avatars of the French Resistance, militant vegetarians, nudists, feminists, advocates of free loves, and many other things. A French surrealist hoaxer named Gérard de Sède floated the idea that the treasure of the Cathars may have actually been the bones of Jesus Christ. So let's back up again. At the turn of the century, in a small Languedoc village, the local curé, a small poor Languedoc village, the local curé built some fabulously ornate buildings. His church decorated with a statue of Baphomet, the Middle Ages' most beloved devil. So the hoax story went thus. Mary Magdalene and her husband Jesus fled the Holy Land and ended up in what is now France, founding the lineage of Merovingian kings. You will remember the kings who fell asleep in their ox carts. Kings who were, incidentally, Jewish. So Jesus died in France. The country curé had discovered the bones of Jesus, the Cathar treasure, or some parchments affirming their existence, and had been extorting fabulous sums from the Vatican in exchange for keeping quiet. Hence his building spree. So, that was Gérard de Sède's tale. His tale was anglicized in the 1970s, English bestseller Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which went into more than 40 editions. It made the curé's village, Rennes-le-Château, a mecca for the esoterically minded. It is one of the strangest places in France, stranger even than Lourdes. Yet not all of the believers were benign. For example, the Order of the Solar Temple, the Franco-Swiss-Quebecois death cult, specializing in carefully orchestrated mass suicide in the 1990s, found inspiration in the Cathar story. As did Marshall Applewhite's Heaven's Gate cult, whose literature teemed with references to the good God hiding behind another God. You will remember that 39 of them committed mass suicide in California in 1997 at the approach of the Hale-Bopp comet. So most of the influences are far more benign. So the story of the Cathars continues to be a spiritual curio. In my experience, it rears up every generation or so. Its latest manifestation was Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, which more or less lifted everything from Holy Blood, Holy Grail, whose authors, by the way, sued Brown for plagiarism and lost, the judge dryly noting that they had lifted everything from the French guy in the first place. So we're at the finish line. The Cathars sought to leave the material world, and they did, 700 years ago, but not definitively, as they have been reincarnated in the imagination of successive generations in our time. As we say in French, les Cathars sont morts, vive les Cathars. Oh, or to translate it into a less occult language, the Cathars are dead. Long live the Cathars. Thank you. So, any questions or... Yes?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. Those of us who have read The Perfect Heresy too many years ago, it was nice to get that wonderful sort of refresher of so much of that history. And obviously, it's a history that's very, very important for us. I do have one question regarding the relationship between the Cathars and the Jews. Because you did seem to indicate that there was a certain kind of openness, to Jews, to Muslims. Does the Cathar hatred, might be too strong a word, maybe not, for the Old Testament God ever manifest as any form of anti-Semitism within that community?
There's absolutely no record of it.
Okay.
What little things we have of Cathar scriptures, it's not very many documents, like 2 or 3. The Old Testament is just glossed over very, very quickly. It's through Inquisition interrogations that we know of that. What's interesting, though, people are wondering if there is a connection between the Cathars and the Jews, because the Coterminous, exactly the same place at the same time, along the coast of Languedoc and Catalonia, in Girona and Lunel, the Jews there were developing the Kabbalah. And that's also a place where spiritual Franciscans developed, as well as in Italy. So there was a hell of a lot going on in that one small region. But there is no paper trail of there being anything. The only thing we really know about the Cathars and the Jews is they protected the Jews. And it's thought by Cathar apologists that they were kind of laid back. Everyone is going to get around to becoming a Cathar. It wasn't really a proselytizing religion. It's just...
Which was going to be my other question, so
Yeah.
I appreciate you mentioning it.
Yeah. But it is fascinating. That whole, if somebody finds a document linking the two, the Jews, the Kabbalah, and the Cathars, that would be mind-blowing.
Groundbreaking.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Yes?
Is there any known connection between, do they know any of the methods by which the Cathar faith was propagated? You mentioned the preachers, itinerant preachers in pairs, and a pair of preachers seems suggestive in the context of like a dualist.
Yes. That's what's thought. It's thought that it's also for protection, because the roads were not safe, but it's thought that the number 2 was so important in the Cathar thing, so it would naturally be in pairs. And of course, as it developed in Languedoc, there were also safe houses where they could preach. You know, as I mentioned, these noble women who turned Cathar, they would no longer be forced to preach in the fields. And anyway, they didn't really, they could preach in the village square as well, because there was no effective apparatus of repression. You know, many of the curés in these local villages wouldn't know theology from a barn door, so they wouldn't know if the beliefs were heterodox or not. And even if they knew, who were they going to call? There were no police. The royal sergeants were off in Carcassonne, far away. So yeah, they weren't in hiding really. Yeah. But they were distinctive, yeah. Yes.
It's been a while since I've gone through the Perfect Heresy in its entire, and I know that like one of the saints that we have, of our church is of course Esclamo and the Fall.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and and I've always wondered, because I've always heard it as apocryphal stories that essentially that you talked about the the different elements with which the Catholic Church faced off against the Cathars, one of them being talked. But I had always heard kind of apocryphal stories or legends about the Cathars essentially handing the church debating team their ass repeatedly in debates.
In the early days, yeah.
Yeah, and so those are, as you've looked at a lot of sources and records, I just wanted to see how true was that? Did they actually, was it, when the church attempted to, engage through preaching and reason kind of thing in front of the, in front of the public with the votes that you mentioned, that essentially the Cathars consistently won the debate.
Right.
Nobody. Relayed to me.
Yeah, I don't think any minds were changed.
Yeah.
You didn't have Catholics suddenly becoming Cathars, or it's kind of interesting to know if people actually knew who was Catholic or who was Catholic. They might have conflated the two. But Esclarmonde did try to speak at one of those debates, and the Friar of Carcassonne said, "Go back to your knitting, madam. You have no place here," which is funny. But Esclarmonde de Foix, yeah, she was a great noblewoman. But the church is just so good at deflection. They quickly invented this thing called the miracle of fire. You know about that? About the debates. So here's the story, and it's been reproduced in paintings, and paintings is all part of the hagiography of Dominic. And so during one of the debates in Fangeau, a Cathar rushed the table and threw Dominic's debating notes into the fire. It would not burn, and it rose up to the ceiling, at which you can still see the charred ceiling beam today, and then fell back down to earth. So that's called the miracle of fire at Fangeau. But if it happened, I don't know. I doubt it, but it is. That's probably, if you talk to a Dominican about the debates, they'll say, "Oh yes, the miracle of fire." That's probably as far as they'll go.
I was going to make a joke about bullshit not being very flammable. We'll just edit that in post.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, it's all very interesting. Of course, now the history being historiography, there's among some historians saying we have exaggerated the extent of Catharism. And in fact, most of the people who describe the Cathars were enemies of the Cathars, so they had to exaggerate the threat. So we've got extremists who say the Cathars no longer existed, which is ridiculous, because there are so many contemporary accounts. But there are some historians now saying that, no, they were not a church. They were discrete groups of people who did not organize into dioceses and things like that. Because it's not the Cathars who said that they organized into dioceses. It's later people of the same generation, but churchmen saying that. So that's always the back and forth of historiography. I don't buy it. I just think that the documentary evidence for their having existed as an organized entity is too strong. As you know, I talked about the lone charismatic preachers. Of course, they were not connected. But I mean, the thicket of kinship, the tissue of responsibilities and cities was just too great in the Languedoc.
I was going to say you anticipated another question of mine, because I've encountered, I think in the last year or two, there was a scholar who came forward, I'm not sure who, but he came across my news feed who was positing that the Cathars as such never existed.
Yeah.
It shows up every once in a while.
Yeah, and I was thinking, no, I don't think that's right. So.
Yeah. No, there's the dean of Cathar Studies. He's at the end of his life. He just published a bombshell book. It's like an academic who's so tired of his subject that he trashes it at the end, kind of like Bernard Lewis, who was the West's expert on Arab and Islam, and then in his last decade has become very Islamophobic. He's at Princeton. But anyway, his name is R.I. Moore, and he's taking the extremist position. And his arguments are hanging by a thread, he reads into every document the maximalist interpretation when you say no. So
there's also folks that say Gnosticism proper as a category. Those groups didn't exist as well.
Yeah, I think that's a bit of a fad, especially on the
Yeah.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, this ancient group never actually existed. We created it. Yeah, it's not just the Gnostics and the
And the more moderate position is that Gnosticism as a diverse movement never existed as a category, and that actually seems to be more accurate to 19th century terminology.
yeah.
Would you be willing to say a little bit about the ceremony of the Endura? Was that, I've seen it sort of tossed around a little bit, and I think similar to what we're saying here, some people suggest that it's a fantastic sort of fabrication. Others say it was a legitimate discipline. Where do you fall down with that?
Okay, so
After long days of teaching.
Yeah, I do.
what'd you say? He talks about so the Endura. I don't know if anybody knows. Is like when you're on your deathbed, you starve yourself to death. You don't eat anything, and then somebody comes and gives you the consolamentum, and that means you're perfect. And that means you go to the good God immediately. Yeah, I think there's some truth to it. I think in Catharism in its decadence, which was the Cathar revival at the beginning of the 14th century, the Autier brothers, they basically were going around just administering the consolamentum. But that's having said that, may I waffle, it is also used for as a calumny against the Cathars, saying that Catharism was the religion of death. And it was against procreation. It meant race suicide and its love of death. I don't know. I just think it's a sort of a last rites. And I don't consider it a sacrament. The main sacrament was the consolamentum.
So the Endora is starving to death at the end?
Yes.
But you would never choose that in the prime of your life. You would never sort of decide, oh, well, I'm going to starve myself to death even though I'm perfectly healthy. You do it at your death.
The Jains still do that. It's still kind of seen
Right,
the ultimate
yeah.
end of dying.
Yeah.
There's Buddhist groups that do it too.
Yeah.
Where-
And doesn't that just happen in general? Like, I just know people who've been asked, should we continue to feed my elderly mother or not? That's,
It's like let everything shut down and just stop continuously supporting it.
I was
right.
going to say that, well, even with the consolamentum, it seems to be like a, at least as I understand the history, and also as you relate in your talk, that it's kind of a kind of, second life or second part of life vocation, that after everything else kind of material is down and they're older, and essentially that then, once they didn't have other concerns, they would take on the rigors of the consolamentum, and possibly with that, with the Endura at the end of the life, I guess when they're most able to pull it off.
One of the most remarkable stories, and this one we know to be true because it was written by a Dominican who was in favor of the action. So there's a woman dying in a house in Toulouse in 1234, an old woman. She desperately wants to see one of the perfect so he can administer the consolamentum. So a spy tells the Catholic Bishop of Toulouse of this. So he dresses up as a Cathar perfect, goes into the bedroom, and with her brothers are there and the rest of it. And are you one of the perfect? Yes. And then he asks her a couple of questions, and then he says, Madam, you are a heretic. You deserve to be burned. And so there's a posse of Dominicans outside. She's too weak to be taken out, so they hoist her bed out the window and carry her through the streets. And she's dying. And they have a bonfire, and they throw the bed on the bonfire. They burn her they're rushing to burn her before she dies. And then they go back, as the person who I've related in The Perfect Heresy, and then they go back and they celebrate because they've just done such an awesome deed, Terrible what but can you imagine just like going in and pretending to be somebody and then winching them out and burning them?
And still thinking you're the good guys.
Yeah, there's something wrong there, yeah.
Am I correct in remembering that the status of parfait could be lost? That if you it wasn't just a one-shot deal that you had it and then you were a perfect forever. It was something that would have to be redone if you lapsed in some.
And
in some
anyone you had ever consoled,
That's right.
they would lose their status.
That's right.
Right.
That would make for some messy times.
Yeah, no, they were
Responsibility.
they were heretics in many ways, but they were Donatist heretics. Right? You can't administer sacrament if the administrator is corrupt, right? Whereas the church says you can, right? But no, that was a real mess. So if a perfect suddenly, like, she suddenly slept with somebody or he suddenly slept with somebody, anybody that they had consoled was that whole line.
Becomes polluted.
Yeah, because they thought it was like.
Assuming they said anything about it,
We'd be dead screwed.
Yeah.
They appeared as pairs? That's how they always went? This is how you knew who they were? When the preachers...
Actually, that's not clear. We don't really know.
Okay.
But we do know that they were always in pairs, and they were always advised to travel in pairs.
And pairs. This is just, which of the Gospels does Jesus send the disciples out in pairs? And one of the...
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I can't remember. I just read it the other day, and I can't remember which one it
As
was.
you say, chances are they're not 19 and they don't have name badges.
Yeah, right.
Or ties. Ties and white shirt.
And that reminds me a little of Dwanell's church, where every diocese supposedly had a bishop and a Sophia.
Yeah.
Yeah, right, right, yeah.
As a
But, and that can be traced
Cathar-inspired
back to an
movement.
early Gnostic who found his Sophia in a
Yep.
brothel and it's traveled around.
Oh, Simon Magus.
Magus.
Yeah,
Simon and
as the
Hannah.
story goes, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
folks knew how to party.
Yes. Okay, well, thank you. This was the best crowd I've ever given a perfect heresy talk to. Thank you.